Hello, hello, dear hearts. Marilyn here with another segment of Wisdom's Way of Learning, and we're going through my journey in Search for the Way. We went through the first two chapters last week, and we're going through the last two this week, which are the most inspiring. We kind of laid a foundation with what I was going through in the dry desert of curriculum and explaining how I came into self-study and how education began turning into a more inspiring adventure for me. And now we're going to go into how I crossed the Jordan River into a new system, a new way of doing life and education in my family. It was the most inspiring, most exciting time of my life. No kidding. So this was the spring and the fall of 1990. Let me see. So what I wanted to kick it off with is I'm going to be encouraging you to get a real life with your children. Learn how to live a real life with purpose and learn how to release them into real life. And you're going to see through my testimony what I had to go through. Well, you already saw some of it, but this particular year, it was so significant. And because I was really fearfully obeying the Lord with what he was having me do. And I am going to describe how my vision changed, what the Lord opened my eyes to see, and you're going to see clearly many things probably in your own children, in your own lifestyle that perhaps you haven't seen yet. And so I'm excited to share with you, and I'm really hoping and praying that that you allow God to open your eyes like never before and free you into, free you from fear and into the freedom that Christ bought for you and your family. Thank you, Jesus. And so as you can see through the teachings and Wisdom's Way of Learning, that I'm not just into natural learning. I'm into biblical principle-based living, obeying God according to sound biblical principles, because God's ways of living and doing things and carrying out the most important objectives of life, like discipleship and education, are loaded with wisdom, because he wants the very best for us. He doesn't want you to have gaps in your life and in your children's education. He wants you to have freedom through the hard processes of discipling and educating and training and parenting your children. So I'm excited to share with you today. So my Jordan River, a new system. Now, I remember telling you that I've been studying the word learning and playing around with the Trivium structure of the Middle Ages, which followed along the path of a child's developmental process. And there were 3 stages: preparing, collecting, and communicating. Or processing stage, I think it was. Yes. Processing. And I was playing around with frameworks and things like that, just trying to figure out more what kind of a system could replace the 12 years of subject divided and graded academics that we had been raised in and we were replicating in our home. And so God had been giving me lots of inspiration to let go of some things, but I was still consumed with the need to meet the demands of the all-powerful system of education. I was concerned with subjects, you see. I was still concerned with subject. I had let go of some things. I was introducing more notebooks to my children. I was having them do more blank books, thinking that that was the way. And I'm going to be showing you how that even transitioned into something even better. So I am going to get started here, and I had dug out my old notes and my charts on the Trivium structure and learned to my delight that my understanding of the concepts had increased tremendously. And so, and this is just another principle I'm going to give you. So I had dug out my old notes and charts on that Trivium structure, and I came to see that my understanding of concepts had increased tremendously. And that's for two reasons. One is just life experience. As I'm trying to give my children education, a lot of the learning I was doing, I was educating myself in principles, it was beginning to make more sense, because I would always take real life and look at it and see, okay, now which principle of this, which truth am I seeing here? And I would start to combine the truths with the experiences and see, oh my goodness, my understanding is getting more clear, you see? And I had long ago at that time acknowledged the need for a new framework to replace that subject graded method, but the Trivium structure continued to draw me in and to get to receive more and more understanding from the Lord. I just didn't have it yet, but it did continue to inspire me in this area of need, because for some reason I felt a need to follow some sort of big picture structure. My understanding of even a quality education was still limited to this formal study program, school style, and mostly the academic subjects. So my family's personal homeschool experiences continue to remind me of the yoke the Lord had for us. I just knew there was something better, something more freeing. I just didn't know what it was yet. So I knew at the time that I was in God's divine will. As He faithfully continued to lead me one step at a time, I now realized that separated, subject-divided curriculum approach was no longer a primary consideration, but that the learning tools needed to become the central focus of our homeschooling effort. You see, I was beginning to see, because at the time, remember, I had been going through the principle approach with my children. I was having them make notebooks, taking notes on history and geography, and I even did some language and math with them that way. But we did that for 3 years, and I realized that it was intense for their ages. And I also realized that I would be overworking indefinitely. It was labor intensive for me. And if you go back and listen to that recording from last week, you'll see why, because I described what I was doing. So the Lord was bringing me into increasingly more freedom in my thinking. And so He'd been nudging me for over a year to write about what He had taught me. And I knew that it was now time to begin. And so I had been experiencing a call to write. And tremendous insecurities rose within me whenever I thought of writing. I had never written and therefore didn't know how. I had poor recall and delayed response in processing new information. I'm one of those that after a conversation, I think about all the things that I could have said when I really didn't say anything because I couldn't come up with it fast enough in the flow of conversation. And even this morning, I had to tell my chiropractor, I'm sorry, but your vocabulary isn't something that I live with every day. I know that you do. And because I don't live with it every day, it's not my regular daily vocabulary. I need you to speak a little more slowly so I can catch and track with what you're saying. I'm constantly having to ask him to repeat himself because he's talking so fast. Anyway, that's a new experience. Now, I'm much quicker than I used to be simply because of education and lifespan of having done everything that I have done, all the speaking I've done and writing I've done, but I still process mentally more slowly than a lot of people I know. It seemed at that time, and I was uneducated. Had just begun to get an education in 1987, and it was now 1990, and it seemed to take me twice as long as the next person to process a conversation of the most superficial kind. I lacked a flow of words. When speaking, my thoughts always seemed to come out in fragmented sentences, and that was my condition then. I don't have that condition today. I tended to also think in reverse from the end to the beginning, like reading a book backwards. And following a vision to completion seemed easy, even though I possessed only a vague sense of what steps I needed to take to get there. You see, I didn't need to write for my sake. I've been obeying God now for 6 years, and I had a sense of what I was supposed to do. I never really put very much into words for the sake of conversation and being understood by others. But how could I define those steps and place concrete labels on them for others to follow? My mind just didn't work that way. I wasn't detail-oriented enough, nor did I think I had the everyday vocabulary necessary to communicate the insights. Now, everyday vocabulary, meaning that I didn't live in bigger abstract concepts. I didn't live in it. I had only begun to live in a real meditative process those 3 years where I was really background processing a lot of information to try to make connections between words and ideas. I'd shown you some of that of my study on learning, how I had done that. I studied the data and I was constantly rearranging it to make sense out of it, but I was challenged to do that. Today, I could go zip, zip, zip and arrange a bunch of content really fast and make connections really fast between ideas and organize it. I can do that today very quickly because it's in me to do, but it wasn't then. Then it was a huge challenge for me. So the thought to write was still a very scary idea, feeling like I was extremely inadequate to do so. I knew that teachers had the ability to communicate insights, but teaching wasn't my gift. Well, at least not yet. And I'm still not really teacher gifted, even though I've done a lot of teaching. It's not really where my primary gift lies. Anyway, but this problem with reverse processing would continue to be a thorn in my flesh throughout my future writing career. It always required endless cutting and pasting to get my thoughts in order. My thoughts would come out in reverse, and I came to understand that I was wired with a prophetic gifting that would always be looking toward or forward into the future, which is why I was drawn to read the back of books first. And I still do that today. With poor vocabulary, memory abilities, and weak recall, I knew I would be stretched to the limit in my writing. But God had been instilling so much raw material and understanding of abstract ideas in me, it just needed an outlet to be expressed and become concrete. So I want to talk about insights with no labels. Writing was a major milestone and turning point in my life. It actually became my Jordan River, representing a death. Now, I want you to follow this journey with me closely because it actually figures in to the framework, the lifestyle learning framework. You're going to see why I developed it the way I did. I was conceiving it based upon my understanding of how I learned and based upon the understanding of how my kids learned and their processes. And I don't think that we're all that far off from anybody else. But beginning in our early stages of learning, this is where I was drawing my understanding from, okay? But yes, a death took place within me as I yielded more fully to the Lord's direction for my life. It's similar to the death I experienced when I first began homeschooling. Remember, I said that I felt it was a death sentence for me. Like my life was dying, that I would never have a life again. It is so laughable. God had so much better for me than what I was giving up. But that's what I experienced was real, though. It was very big to my soul at that time. And so crossing the Jordan River into the idea, the calling of a call to write, to write my ideas, to get them conceived and put labels on them. That was huge to me. It was this decision to write that actually brought our home school into the promised land. Well, why is that? Well, unknowingly at the time, I had completed, I didn't know this yet, but I was going to learn it really soon. It was going to be revealed to me really soon. At the time, I had completed the first 2 stages of my learning process. I had collected volumes of knowledge about learning. That's stage 1, collecting. And now this is my own self-education I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a prescribed academic course that someone else made up for me. I'm talking about the life-giving, purpose-filled, rich and deep education God gave me as I was spirit-led, following Him. He was my partner in education. He was my director. He corrected me. He course corrected me. He instructed me. He directed me. You see? And then I had been processing all of that knowledge, stage 2, for 3 years. You see? But I had yet to communicate it. Stage 3. You see? Collecting, processing, which is the mental activity of figuring out how it relates to my life, uncovering the main ideas, making all the connections, finding the biblical principles. You see, the biblical source and origin of a subject, the end and purpose of the subject of learning, and the biblical commands of that subject. Finding the principles, the biggest challenge of all. That's the reasoning. So that's the thinking stage. So I'd been processing, thinking and reasoning. That's what processing is doing. It's thinking and reasoning. And then I had stage 3. So I had stage 1, collecting, stage 2, processing, which is the thinking and the reasoning, stage 3, the communicating. You see? So God knew that writing was the powerful 3rd phase of the learning process that I needed to complete my education and bring me into his established purpose. So God had given me a yet unformed life message. Writing was the only way to bring it into a concrete, substantial form and ultimately make it practical for others to use. So I had more concepts and ideas floating around in my head than I had labels and terms with which to express them. Insights without any labels are not very helpful to anyone but me. So I could only make broad generalizations and connections. If I would try to tell anybody anything, well, I would try to tell Jim. Was the only one that I really ever talked to about any of this stuff. And all I could ever do was share broad generalizations and connections with him. I couldn't really explain it very well. I couldn't break a whole idea into connective parts and call it something. Now, 2 examples of this are in Wisdom's Way of Learning, book 2, which I call the Unit of Life Learning Model, and book 3 that I call the Life Message Learning Model. And I have them right here. I can show them to you. You can find these on the websites. Well, actually, the whole set is on the website. It's in digital format, and this is a hard copy. I only have 2 of these left. This is the complete set. And here we have the first one is the Science, Art, and Tools of Learning that we've been going through. And the second one, the Unit of Life Learning Model, and the Life Message Learning Model. And then, of course, we have Seasons God's Time Design, and that's where I describe the framework that I came up with more fully. So I'm going to show you while I have these in my hand, okay, because I wanted to show you some things, actual things. I have a little packet of photos here because I've told you that Catherine drew these covers, these collages, and I just happen to have a few of the pictures set aside. I don't know where the others are. So you see this picture, drawing, Catherine drew, copying photos. You see that? That's her. She was planting seed. And of course, then John and Jim are there too. And she copied that picture. And then she took these from real butterfly collection that she had and different objects that we happened to have hanging around. She used this to water the seeds in the greenhouse that we had built for the kids. And of course, she had pictures of all of these from our real life. And so she combined them all and made a collage for this book. Now, she did the same thing with this one. I think, I'm not going to find that very easily. She had copied a picture of me and then made it look like, no, that's not what I wanted to say. She had seen a picture of my books, all right, and I used these pictures in my displays at Lifestyle Learning Conferences where I was teaching the models, and I had these big board displays that I used to describe the models. And so when she made these covers, she copied those pictures. And so these books are actually my books. And then she had a picture of herself doing her work at the table that she put in front of my books there to look like, you know, she's studying those particular books, which she didn't actually do. I mean, this was a collage that she was creating. I had my journals. That's part of that picture. Here's the picture of her studying. That she has right here on the cover. See that? And that's how she drew. She copied. All right. Then there's one here of John riding his bicycle. Now, which cover is that on? Here it is. It's the SAT book. And you can see him riding his bicycle right there. And of course, this is her horse, Sophie, and her camera at the time, and her painting things, and their telescope. I mean, they had these things, and she just copied them and then put it together in a collage. I wanted you to see that because I don't think anybody really knew how she came up with these picture drawings. And this is the book that we're going through right now, My Journey in Search for the Way. She made this as well. She knows that this is one of my very favorite ideas, the wide path and the narrow path that leads to life. In fact, now this was just a drawing that she came up with. This is a miniature photo of a painting that she did for me, and it is the very first, actually it was the only oil painting she ever did. It was her very first, and so you can see the path in the woods, and it's diverging here. And what she put there was the text from a favorite poem of mine. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. That was Robert Frost, yes, or less traveled. And the reason she knew that is because I used to, when we were in the woods and we were having to make a choice, we did a lot of hiking when they were kids, and I would quote that, and Matthew 7:13-14, so I have that on the back, and I would tell the kids, this is just like the scripture, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad and easy to travel is the path that leads the way to destruction and eternal loss, and there are many who enter through it, but small is the gate, narrow and difficult to travel is the path that leads the way to everlasting life, and there are few who find it. And I am really hoping and praying that you find this narrow way to life in your homeschooling, bringing up of your family. Thank you, Lord. So anyway, that was all I wanted to show you about the book covers and how they came to be. She's just very creative that way and figuring out how to put together a collage. All right, so in these books, the Unit of Life Learning Model and the Life Message Learning Model, this is where I present the 4 informal and the 4 formal learning activities for lifestyle learning, giving some structure to the natural activities of learning and delight-directed interests. Now, while we had been living out these activities in our lives, I didn't have them grouped in my mind as a goal-setting model. Most of the time, I simply had a sense of intuitive wisdom and guidance from the Lord that this activity or that activity was right and good. So I didn't call it anything. In my personal life, I never actually needed to write and conceive those models in order to continue obeying the Lord for direction in my children's education. Like I said a few moments ago, I just knew by that time I'd obeyed the Lord so much, I knew I was going to continue obeying the Lord and that He would make sure I was covering our bases well. But when I began to write, the meditation of years had to begin coming out in the form of words and sentences and concepts into labels. I never had really the privilege of discussing these things much at all. So this was due to the fact that the Lord had called our family into a season of solitude for the purpose of restoration and spiritual growth in our family. I had yet to bounce even one idea off of anyone other than the broad generalizations I was making for Jim. And I barely told Jim anything because of his heavy work schedule. So instead of burdening him further, I simply asked him to read a couple of paragraphs here and there in some book or something, or I would read to him something that I had written out, like a paragraph or two, something I was trying to conceive myself so that he could track with me. And as long as he saw evident and concrete progress in the kids' lives, he felt good about whatever I did. So I had heard that exchanging ideas helps to begin a flow of creative thought, but I hadn't yet been provided that opportunity, and I knew I was walking in truth and wisdom, but I had few words with which to express myself. Now, haven't you ever been in a group? I mean, we do this just at our local gatherings every Sunday night. I let everybody have the floor if they have something to say, and we bounce off of each other. And when we do that, we get additional insight and revelation for the things that we already know, because for the most part everybody has a lot of stuff inside of them, dumbly struggling for utterance and for getting expressed. You know, everybody has. And if you're not a teacher, or you don't have a ministry where you're influencing people, the normal person doesn't have the kind of outlet required to actually conceive a tremendous amount of vocabulary and communication skills for the things that they know. They don't have the reason to do that, you see. So in me, many wonderful insights had been bottled up for a really long time, keeping me slightly frustrated. Writing served to help me give form to the ideas and principles that I'd been living and walking in now for several years. The analytical skills required to write increased my understanding by leaps and bounds, actually furthering my education and releasing me into more and more freedom in our learning lifestyle. And although you could say that I graduated from my season of study, the education I began for myself remained ongoing. I moved into a new season, which served to more fully complete my education. The communication stage of learning when rhetoric is practiced. So the art of rhetoric or persuasive communication is just that. It's an art, and something which requires much practice to perfect. The communication stage of learning will never end. Preparing myself with advanced scholarship skills gave me the vision I once lacked, and it freed me to pursue a quality education for my children. So the lifestyle learning framework that I introduced in this book, Book 3 Seasons, God's Time Design, had been an integral part of my mindset for quite some time. Okay, so this lifestyle learning framework that I introduced in Book 4 had been a part of my mindset for some time. It's like I said earlier, I was meditating on these ideas and taking my understanding of learning and melding it with what I understood about the Trivium structure of the Middle Ages, which only had those 3 stages, and I ended up conceiving 4 stages of the learning process. But it was during this precious season of rest the Lord gave me, and I described that in the last video, how God was calling me to rest and look at some things. But it was during that precious season that the pieces finally began to fall into place for me. No longer would I have to aimlessly steer my children through their education. And so I no longer believed that my children needed so many generic learning experiences on purpose that had nothing to do with our life. I knew what my current education required, and the preparation was simple, the process was simple, the method was simple, the curriculum was simple. And while it was all simple, it possessed the power to change my life. And so my education was accomplished in brief seasons with varying degrees of intensity, which focused on only a couple of learning activities at a time. Now, what do? We put kids in school for 9 months of the year, okay? One long season, and they get a winter break. You know, they get this little brief break. But their season of academic work is very, very long, and it's unnaturally long. My education was accomplished in brief seasons. I had a lot of responsibility. I had to educate my family. I was at home. I had a family to take care of. You see, a husband who worked a job. We had things going on. You see, so I had to do everything in varying degrees of intensity and periodically. I couldn't just do all the stuff all the time like they expect you to do in a school setting. So I focused on a couple learning objectives at a time in brief seasons. So why couldn't my children have such an experience too? Why couldn't they? No learning activity was more important than another one. So as I approached life, I approached learning and personal growth with a singular mindset. Think of this: life, learning, personal growth. Single mindset. I ended up becoming good at all I tackled because all of it was important. It wasn't less important to feed my family. It wasn't less important to have playtimes. It wasn't less important to have a delight-directed path for our children. Those things were equally important to table time, you see? And yet, people are so concerned about so much time spent at a desk, thinking that the rest of it doesn't matter. The relationships are not less important. Training your children aren't less important. The parenting, it's not less important. So while each discipline I embraced was necessary to aid the others, I didn't have to cover the basis all the time, fearing I was creating gaps in my education. Nor did I have to force my children to do so. All right? I told you I spent 4 years on that study. Honestly, I think I only spent maybe 2 or 3 extended seasons. And extended by that I mean the first season was 5 months. I continued to think and process and reason while I was doing real life and educating my children. And then periodically I might go look at my notes to refresh my memory at something, but I wouldn't actually delve into additional study. There were only like 2 or 3 times when I delved into additional study, and I would play around with the framework idea and things like that. And as I got inspiration, yes, then I would play around with it a little, but those would just be moments. Those would be like a day here and a day there. But as far as a season, 2 or 3 in 4 years, okay? Each new discipline that I began was determined by the one before and simply built upon it. Okay? Principle, okay? A steady progress forward toward the desired result. That's a product and process principle that I taught you. So just like this mindset, sowing and reaping, that God has taught us, remember that in history it's called cause and effect. In learning it's called process and product in our spiritual life and in our relational life and in every area of our life. Really, it's called sowing and reaping. It's what you sow, you reap. Whatever your process is going to produce a particular product. So this process led to more fullness of growth, understanding, and purpose. So I'm going to describe the Lord's yoke. This is 1991 and 1992. Demystifying education. What a task. There were so many thick layers of nonsense to peel off in order to expose the reality of learning's simplicity. Oh, Jesus, he died to set us free, ladies. When will we ever really know this truth? Galatians 5:1, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. You see, we have here, I've got a little reminder note here to tell you something. God made you a free people, but you still think like a slave. Now that you've got your children back physically from Egypt, you need to get them back spiritually and emotionally as well. There is freedom outside the system. There's freedom outside of Egypt, you see. God doesn't want us entangled in bondage. He doesn't want us entangled in a man-made system. If there's any kind of a system, it's principle-based, which means that it stretches and it breathes and it's life-giving, and it just gives us a guideline. It's not something to strictly adhere to, because God brings freedom to our lives. What did Jesus come to set us free from? Well, everybody seems to know the answer to this question: sin. But what is it? What is that? Well, whatever is not of faith is sin. Romans 14:23. How much faith are you applying and exercising in your homeschooling endeavors? I can tell you that I was applying a tremendous amount of faith. I was walking in faith, because I was following the Holy Spirit's directives, you see? My faith grew by leaps and bounds, and I became strong on the inside of myself, you see? But when you're just following a man-made system, where do you need your faith? You don't need it in God, that's for sure. Without faith, the scripture says, Hebrews 11:6, it's impossible to please him. So if it's not faith from God and faith in God, what is it? It's of a self-nature. Faith in oneself, faith in the system. It's that kind of faith. And so this encompasses our entire being, our motives, our ideas, our ways. He came to set us free from the bondage of our own ways, from man-made ways. He said, learn from me. This is Jesus' own words. Learn from me, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. This is Matthew 11, verse 30. This truth had become so real to me by this time, so full of life. And I just thought, if only I had obeyed more fully, if only I had not wasted so much time in fear, if only I had let go sooner. When I first felt the nudge from the Holy Spirit, which had been a year prior, in 1989, I didn't let go until 1990, but 1989, I felt the first nudge from the Holy Spirit to let go. How much more wonderful our home life would have been. Oh, I regretted that so much. But it wasn't just about me. It was also about my husband. And fear was still ruling his life. He wasn't confident in that yet. And so I waited another year before I really let go. But you see, I was the only model that I could look to requiring a higher quality home education that would lead to a fuller life purpose experience. I continued to objectively look at my life, both the bad fruit from the long ago past and the good fruit from the more recent past and present. And my education began as a 36-year-old with tremendous responsibilities pressing in on me. As I looked into my daughter's life, I wondered how I would bridge the age-ability gap for her in order to guide her toward a similar course of study. Now, she was about probably 13 at this time when I was conceiving these ideas. So I came to realize that my study and discipling experience was not beyond the abilities of a well-prepared, serious high school student. And this served to close the gap quite a bit. So as I continued to examine her growth, I was encouraged as she was approaching the threshold of a season of study. Now, in retrospect, as I revise some of this, I would say she was high school or early college. And I did say that, didn't I? Early college student. Okay. Because of the blossoming now unfolding in her life, it helped me to put form to many insights, and I began to attach identification labels to them. So I'm going to describe my study season a little bit more for you. The old system had always made me feel we were behind. Haven't you? Don't you really relate with that? Oh, we're behind. We have so much to do. Oh, what a burden. What a burden that was. What a burden it is. And I knew this was a deception because the simplicity of my own educational experience had served to launch me into vital life purpose. You see, it was exciting and interesting to note that my 3-year season of spirit-led, self-directed study prior to my writing season, now that 3-year period included all the principal approach, curriculum I was writing for my children. I was studying the principal approach, and then I started studying the word learning, you see. But that 3-year season of spirit-led, self-directed study was equivalent to the time a student spends in high school. And only I had experienced far more benefit than a student usually possesses upon graduation. So the types of learning activity the 3 years consisted of is crucial to your understanding of Wisdom's Way of Learning, books 2 and 3, where I introduce those learning models. There's 4 activities for the informal and 4 activities for the formal learning models. So I was not buried in intense study for 3 years, as it might seem, and nor was I into heavy reading or reference work every day. Initially, I spent about 5 to 6 months in daily study, like I said. But even this was limited to afternoons when kids were out playing and weekends. And so after that, I tempered the original study with other less demanding reading and simple meditation, you see? And that's how the seasons flowed. I would do some intense studying, and I would temper that with just lots of background processing as I went about my life and referring to notes once in a while to refresh my memory of some concept that the Lord was trying to give me connections for. And then maybe I would read books that had something to do with what my interest was at the time, or books, spiritual growth books having to do with the cross of Jesus Christ and that Christian heritage I would read about. So I was either engaged in writing or compiling curriculum. That's what I was doing. It was like my hobby. And so I continued to teach my children with the principal approach, as I had not yet entered my season of rest from school. So I read a lot, I journaled, I meditated, and tested theory in my home. And I spent quality and quantity time praying and worshiping the Lord at night after the kids were in bed. Jim was on a swing shift schedule, so I had that time to myself with the Lord. And I picked up the initial study, it says here, only on 2 additional occasions, both of which were brief 1 to 2 month seasons over a period of 4 years or so. So here it is, documented So I only actually studied that learning study of mine briefly for 2 additional seasons. So this biblical study in conjunction with all the other learning activities, so it was all worked together, and seeking God, obeying him with my whole heart, resulted in building within me a true education that was strong, equipping, and life-changing in nature. Okay, now remember, I'm describing someone who had been born again 6 years prior. What I'm writing about right now, 1990, 1991, and 92, I had only been born again for 6 years at that point. And those last 3 is when I was really honing in on a spirit-led self-education, right? I would feel quite remiss if I didn't stress the importance of a yielded heart while studying. The condition of my heart was the main contributing factor to the role that studying played in my life. I've heard of people doing studies and it's not impactful in changing their life like it did for me. It's because of the lack of obedience. You see, all of these had to work together. I was being spirit-led in my life. I was walking by faith. That means faith, going into unknown places with the Lord. That's what I was doing in my heart, in my relationships, and in my studies. And in my homeschooling and efforts, what I was doing with my children. I was going into unknown places. I had no longer been using prescribed curriculum where it all told you what to do, how long to do it, I didn't have that anymore. Jesus was my teacher. Jesus was providing for me. The Holy Spirit was drawing me, you see? So that had been going on for 3 to 4 years, and I was yielding as much as I could. I'd actually become broken in spirit and was at a completely yielded place in the Lord, and more so than I had ever experienced. So becoming teachable of the Lord was what gave this season so much power to transform my life. And this is what God needs in you, dear hearts. This is what God needs, a heart that approaches him with a poor spirit, willing to be corrected on every preconceived idea about life, even treasured, time-honored, traditional ways of thinking and ways of doing things. So you see, pride needs to be dealt a death blow, because as long as pride is there and you're not willing to give up your ideas, you are not going to learn anything from God. You will not. Without an attitude of repentance and operating in a person's life, what results is knowledge gained that simply puffs up. And that's in 1 Corinthians 8, verse 1. And that knowledge lacks in power to transform the individual. We know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet, as he ought to know. 1 Corinthians 8, verses 1 and 2. We know nothing as we ought to know. In fact, studying vocabulary was the very first eye-opener to me, realizing that I didn't know anything, because every single word had a different meaning than what I thought it was. You come to see how ignorant you really are. You really do. And then just take that into the Word of God and see just what God's ways are, his principles. It's astounding how little we really know. If you're educated by the system and you are educating your children by the system, I can tell you, you don't have an education. And I am emphatic about that. Even the best method of education itself, God's Word, cannot produce in an individual what God has planned for him without a surrendered heart, walking in true faithful obedience. So you see, I knew that any mature teenager or young adult could pursue a similar course of study and with a yielded life could come out ahead of even those peers going off to Bible college or seminary. And God would become deeply, or the person, the individual would become deeply and thoroughly equipped for life, right down to acquiring a specific life message, which would unfold as a lifelong purpose if they did the type of study that I'm referring to. So to those of you with a heart to believe this, yet with one dubious eyebrow raised, I ask, why is it hard to believe that Jesus can prepare us fully for life? And service to God and man? Why is that hard? Why is it so hard? I think it's because of what we see as we survey the canvas of the church. Some people are simply bringing their worldly lifestyles with them into their Christian service. Others are creating entirely new unworldly or religious systems in which to serve God, and both may be leaving God out of it entirely, or he may just happen to be the unconsulted object of their devotion, and labor, and that's a non-spirit-led path. It's a faithless path. No faith is needed. Neither of these ways possesses the power to transform and equip lives for service to the Lord and to society that is actually fulfilling. So to walk with God, we need to leave the wide path of what everyone's doing and place our feet on the narrow path that leads to the cross of Jesus Christ, because his path will always lead us into unknown places that are much better for us than the wide path of where everyone is going. So there we must leave the burdens and the sins of doing things our own way at the foot of the cross. We must then receive his cross to carry as we walk with him down the path of life that he has prepared for us. So following Jesus in Holy Spirit-led, humble obedience is wisdom's way of learning. So now you know why I named it Wisdom's Way of Learning. So now I just want to talk about my daughter Catherine a little bit. And I'm going to be showing you more things too as I get into this. But I've been preparing Catherine for future biblical study in general ways. And intuitively, I knew she needed to have a well-formed learning habits. And up to this point in time, she'd been doing some simple recording, writing, and referencing projects. And I wanted these activities strengthened so she would feel comfortable with rather than afraid or intimidated of a harder study. And so we simply continued with this course of action. Now, I had entered my season of study feeling dread. I didn't know how to learn and didn't have a lifelong habit of learning. So I lacked the impetus and the strength I needed to begin positively and confidently. Actually, it was fear and trembling. I went into it, and some dread because it was so very hard for me. In addition to this, I began my study with an extreme disadvantage because of my emotionally bankrupt condition and character, and God had been in the process of healing my soul, and so it wasn't like I was starting from scratch there. I had experienced some healing in those first 3 years while I was still going through the dry desert of curriculum, because I was obeying the Lord in my home. And so, but I hadn't really read the Bible or studied it before 1987. There wasn't very much I had done. I'd read the Psalms and the Proverbs to my kids and kind of stayed in that area because it felt comfortable to me. And that's where I had my kids doing some of their reading and studying, was in the Psalms and Proverbs. So, but by that time, 1990, 91, I saw that Catherine would begin with many advantages that I never had. And this was tremendously encouraging to me, helping to strengthen my vision for her education and the steps needed in which to direct her. It's so fun. I experienced so many vicarious moments of enjoyment of what my children ended up getting to have in their life and getting to experience in their life and their learning and in their academics, because their lives were so loaded with purpose and mine had not been. You see, so getting to see, I mean, they really were raised in an unusual way according to custom, according to what's customary. They were raised in an unusual way. It was unusual to me. It wasn't unusual to them. To them, it was just natural and fulfilling and purpose-filled and the way reality is. But for me, it was unusual. And so I ended up experiencing a lot of really good things through them that I had missed in my own life. And I'm sure you probably go through that a little bit yourself. So as Catherine grew into adolescence, she began gaining momentum in her own learning activities, and many amateur skills began to take on a more mature form. Her ability to pursue and create her own education was amazing. And I began unconsciously at first to look at her life as a model for the many learning activities of the childhood years. And it was not long before I was consciously analyzing her life. Now, this was objective, examining the fruit and planning steps of direction with a view toward more advanced studies and life purpose. Remember the process product principle, a gradual moving forward toward the desired result. And you're adding line upon line, precept upon precept. So you're adding onto what went before, you see? But I could see this gap was closing between what I had gone through and what Catherine was going through. And it was very easy now to see how close she was to entering a season such as I had undertaken, if that's where her direction led her. So I carefully planned and guided her to make sure she would be ready. So age wouldn't determine her readiness, rather skills, achievements, accomplishments, and other less demanding pursuits would reveal her readiness, but more importantly, her desire and the way God would guide her. So no steps would be skipped. I wanted her ready and willing for whatever she wanted to tackle, and I allowed her to continue developing her talents and abilities. Virtually every means of study that she had used over the years had become more deeply ingrained as a part of her life, a part of daily life. You see, she had become quite skilled in learning. How many of you came home from school choosing to do life according to workbooks and textbooks? How many do that? Nobody does that. No. But the learning tools and the learning activities that were natural and intentionally formed out of a person's interests, they continue because it's a principle. And so it actually helps a child gain momentum in their learning, and they're able to grow their process up and continue doing more life, more learning, more delight-directed interest. They're able, more study, they're able to grow their process up. And so those childhood activities become a part of future teenage years and adult years. You see, not the activities themselves, but the means by which the activities came alive. The learning tools, you see. Catherine had become quite skilled in learning, and if she didn't know something, she knew how to find it. So at the age of 13, she had a variety of well-developed learning tools at her disposal, and she used them daily. And John was well on his way to doing the same thing, and he was 4 years younger, so he was 9 at this time. And I could see that my job would simply get easier with time. And so momentum continued to build as her skills, because remember, gaining momentum, that's part of transferring the learning tools to your kids. They end up gaining momentum in their skills. They can grow their skills up in any direction they feel led, you see. And so this momentum continued to build as her skills became more polished and her creativity blossomed. And she wasn't ever afraid to tackle something new like I had been, because I didn't have the foundation behind me. She had a foundation, and so did John. And by the time John was 13, he had this foundation and he was able to tackle, and he took after me. He had fearful tendencies toward new things that were bigger than him. You see, he had a tendency to want to draw back just like I did. But by the time he was 13, no way. He just kept going, just like Catherine did, adding more and more difficult processes to their lives, you see. So, and more advanced, I should say, processes to their lives. So I was drawing from Catherine's learning experience, and I formulated the Unit of Life learning model. And likewise, drawing from my experience, what began to form was this life message learning model for lifestyle learning. So both study models would give the needed biblical direction and form to a delight-directed learning process so that I could make sure that things were well-rounded, there were no gaps in the exercise of the learning tools, because these 4 activities of the learning model were activities that could take place in real life without textbooks and workbooks, that they could take place and be applied to all delight-directed interests. Every interest they had, all of life experience could experience the application of those learning tools. And so if they leaned heavily toward 2 or 3 of them, but I could see they were leaving out one, I could coax them in their character development to round out the learning tools in all of their projects. That's why they became so skilled. Really, they became very skilled because of the well-rounded approach of using all the learning tools and having character as the focus of my efforts, you see, instead of content. Content was no longer my focus. Character formation was. That was my role as mom and teacher. So I felt that Catherine still needed a bridge. The bridge to go from, to cross over from her well-developed yet informal learning skills into a more formal, advanced type of study. Okay, and I had at one point felt led to have her begin a season of undetermined duration to gather and compile and place into a recognizable form some of the stuff out of her life's learning experiences. And I knew producing these products would help her transition into more demanding learning activities. And so because just like I needed a communicating stage for my learning process to make it, to bring it into more substance and more clarity, I felt that my kids needed a similar stage for the informal activities of learning. God had given me a purpose for learning, not only to benefit from it personally, but to share with others through the written word, producing a product. And I wanted Catherine to ultimately have something to show for her own unique process of learning. And so to do this, the Lord gave me the idea of the Unit of Life book project to help her pull the stuff of her life together. So each project would reflect a unit of Catherine's own life. Now, the Unit of Life book projects gave me a place and form in which to steer her active learning pursuits into formal application. And so when her first project, which was the bird book, was near completion, she initiated another project and then another. And I suppose I should probably show you the bird book right now. Actually, I don't have the big book is 3 inches fat, and it has over 100 pages in it. Much writing. There's much writing in that book. This is my table copy that I had laminated several pages from her bird book. A long time ago, I used to have table copies, and they're color copies of the actual pages, laminated so they wouldn't get ruined, just because hundreds and hundreds of people have gone through them, and I would have them on display at the Lifestyle Learning conferences for people to look at all of the notebooks, and they were all organized according to categories of the 4 informal learning models. I mean, the 4 informal learning activities, the unit of life approach. And so it would describe which part of the system it was reflecting. So this particular one was Catherine's bird book, and this is the cover of it. It's one of our own peacocks, a picture she had taken, and metaphor that she had written about birds and baby Christians. And she did not have at this time artists' colored pencils. She only had regular children's colored pencils, and so the pictures aren't as brilliant as they could have been if I had had the right kind of art tools for her. But she had an extensive feather collection, and I had her collect all of that up. And she did the research and wrote about each bird, and drew a picture and mounted feathers, and they're all identified according to which part of the body they come from. And so I'm just going to flip through this really quick so you can kind of see a little bit of the extensiveness of this project. And this particular one's a rooster and hens, and a story that went along with this. And whoops, my book is falling apart here. Peacock, the one that's on the cover, and more peacock pictures. There's a poem she wrote in memory of Big Bird that was killed. And I know this is a very skimpy part of the book, but another time I'll show you the real book, physical book, and the extensiveness of it. This is taking care of a hummingbird that had been injured, and she got it nursed back to health and let it go. Anyway, this is the record of her bird book and what it contains. And she had a page in here of Texas birds, because at that time we had moved to Texas right after she finished this. And so she was learning about Texas. And I think this is when we finally got her some artist pencils. And so these have a little bit more brilliance to them. Anyway, there's a bird book. And some of it, like I said, it's over 100 pages. And there's lots of long stories in it as well. But Catherine actually really enjoyed this so much that it became almost a matter of convention for her to direct all of her work toward a finished product. Now, we came to realize we couldn't actually do that with real life, because there was so much going on all the time. We had so much purpose in our life, and the kids had so much purpose. They couldn't just go into making a project over everything they were learning. But I came to understand that the projects served a purpose, and once they served their purpose, they didn't have to go create a project for everything they learned. She started out that way, thinking she wanted to, because she had the ability and she enjoyed the results of her labors, and she always shared her work with other people. But anyway, she did come to see she wasn't realistic about the desire to make a notebook out of everything that she was learning. It was never going to happen. So just as my years of study were taking form in writing projects and practical helps for others, Catherine's years of informal study were beginning to do the same. And these book projects had been effective in equipping her in practical ways for further study. It was a great bridge. Even more important was the sense of purpose and direction that the projects lent to her in formal delight-directed learning pursuits, because she actually had to research to get the information she wanted for each of the birds. And she also found all the scriptures she could find on birds in the Bible to include in her work. And then she also wrote out lots of true stories having to do with birds that she experienced growing up with birds. And so all of that is included in her notebook. But I came to see that this model, this learning model, was a great goal-setting model, and it would serve our family and other homeschoolers well who wanted to draw their education out of real-life pursuits. Now, I know that everybody isn't into making books, and in fact, my son John wasn't, but I did have him finish a few notebooks while he was still advancing his skill work. And I wanted him to feel like he had finished something, you see, just like I was doing in writing a book. Catherine was doing in writing or putting together a couple of her books because she needed to have a finished project from an interest that she had been involved in it for many years. In fact, this bird book, it reflects, it has 233 feathers. The collecting and sorting began when she was 6 years old. The projects with feathers, because she made many things with feathers, began when she was 12, and then this project, the bird book, began when she was 14, and it was completed when she was 14 and a half. So it was an extensive long-term interest, you see, since she was 6 years old. She'd been picking up feathers and collecting them, and she had quite the system for organizing them in envelopes. It was a lot of stuff in some jars and things like that. All right, so back to this purpose and direction for formal learning. I knew that study should not be the purpose of education, but simply a means toward an end. And defining the end. What's the end and purpose? What is the biblical end and purpose for study, for learning? Defining that end was essential to acquiring a vision for my children's education. And for the Christian, the defined end to education is supposed to be a life purpose within the context of his relationship with the Lord and his commission for that student's life. So I'd long since concluded it wasn't necessary for my children to know all the underlying governing principles of all the subjects, like the principal approach school did, uncovering those treasures for themselves if they were going to major in math, or they were going to major in history, or they were going to major in any of these subjects as a part of their future purpose, then yes, do that. But uncovering these treasures for themselves was a joy that I didn't want to rob them of. You see, I felt that it wasn't necessary for children to live at a desk all day learning the underlying principles of all the subjects, because again, I felt like that was too intense. It was a waste of their precious lives. They're supposed to be walking in purpose now and defining that and uncovering that, and you can't do that when you're sitting in a desk all day. And I knew that even knowing the biblical principles themselves was secondary to the higher goal of discovering and pursuing individual life purpose within the context of being discipled to Jesus. You see, and this was the education that I desired for them. I told them they could choose to do whatever they wanted to do as long as Jesus was Lord, as long as they were being Spirit-led. So I knew from my personal experience that a quality education could ultimately stem from walking in God-given life purpose. So what had taken shape in my own life would serve as a model to lead my children in their individual ways. And what I considered to be the ultimate study experience to 4R a subject was really only the beginning of a deeper education. So everything prior to that time would simply prepare the student for this. And the study would be just the beginning of acquiring a prevailing, exciting life message that would become a wonderful, unique, and specific and exciting life purpose for the student for the remainder of his life. So this life message learning model would be an excellent goal-setting model for acquiring a higher quality education within the home. So how was a student to determine his area of specialization? Well, Proverbs 22:6 gives us a clue as parents to train up a child in the way he should go and in keeping with his individual gift or bent. And when he is old, he will not depart from it. Simple. As the scripture indicates, care is taken in the formative years to guide a child's interests and to help him develop his talents and gifts that would lead him toward knowing a subject of specialization. You see, because he was allowed his bents. How could he be prepared? Again, simply by helping him develop learning tools using his areas of interest as a subject matter. So not only was I walking in a well-defined life purpose, but my daughter too, at the age of 14, became aware of her unfolding life purpose. So for a year, it slowly began to take shape. And then at the age of 15, she acquired enough long-term vision to determine her immediate educational plan, and she continued to develop it through the ensuing years. Same thing happened with John at about the same age. But I wasn't writing about him in this particular book, so I'm not referring to him that much. But Catherine's favorite pastimes continue to be studying, writing, illustrating, and reading. And this is, to me, a lifestyle of learning and action within the context of purpose, of her choice, of her choosing. So consider your own homeschool journey with God, dear heart. It doesn't matter where you are on your path of life. Simply reach out to him now and ask him to set you firmly on his path for you. He'll lead you faithfully to your promised land, just as he led me. So the wilderness, if that's where you are, traveling right now, and it's only a transition. Remember this, it's only a transition from a place of bondage and burden into God's promised freedom and life. So keep moving with him. Don't stay stuck in your transition. His plan for you and your family is more wonderful than you even hope for yourself. So why not take time this very day to renew your commitment to trust him to show you his way for you. He will not fail you. Trust him. He loves you. This was a door of hope. I loved this in Hosea 2 verses 6 and 7. Therefore, behold, I will hedge up her way with thorns. I will wall her in so that she cannot find her paths. She will chase her lovers, but not overtake them. Yes, she will seek them, but not find them. Then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then it was better for me than now. Now, do you know what this is referring to? Any love that is more important than following God. And in my case, it was curriculum. It was subject graded and divided. It was a focus on subjects and filling those obligations. And so those were my lovers. And I was coming to a place where my false security was being exposed. And so this was the fall of 1988. So I'm going back just a little bit in time here. And I did continue to write curriculum during that time, and motivated out of very deep desire for my children to have a biblical worldview. And so this really challenged me a lot, as I said, and I came to realize that this wouldn't fit into a natural lifestyle because it was just too hard to sustain. I did do this for about 3 years, but it felt more unnatural. I was still kind of doing school at home. Just it was a better quality school, you know, it was a better quality content and knowledge base, but it was still school at home. And I came to see that my security was wrapped up in this idea of school at home and a well-ordered home life. And something happened that was very difficult for me. Jim's schedule changed, and it kind of put me in a hard place of trying to figure out how to homeschool while he was at home during the day. It was really, really hard. It actually left me numb at times, and I was confused. I was frustrated. I barely remember the order of those events that took place during those years, but I cried out to God for answers, and even though I was still frantically trying everything I knew to provide what I thought was the education I wanted, and nothing seemed to work. And beyond learning all the wrong ways to do a thing, I eventually learned how to surrender to the Lord in the area of education, and that's when I began a deeper walk with Him. But I still wanted to go around the wilderness one more time, and so in fall of 1989, this is when I decided to try unit studies one more time. Still thinking of this subject mindset and all this formal table time activity for the kids every day of their life. And so I want to show you a project that I did, and some of you maybe have seen this before. This is an oversized book, and this particular one is my teacher's copy, and this particular one is Catherine's copy that she made. And I chose the topic of the history of communication to create a unit study for the kids to work at. And of course, I did all the research. I did all the collecting of the information and raw material, and I organized it for my kids and to put in a book, and with lots of projects to make it interesting. And I felt sure that designing my own unit of study would be the key to bringing life and reality into the learning experience. So I'd been doing the principal approach, and I knew I was overdoing that. So then I came to do this unit study, and this was the last hurrah. This was my last big stab at doing academics for their sake alone, you know, any kind of knowledge for its sake alone. But I designed this unit, and I actually had to use the 4R study model that I redefined as the 5 learning tools in order to create this, to gather all this content. So I ended up having to use all the learning tools on this. I spent a great deal of time collecting information, which was research and record. And then I compiled my notes into an outline, which was reason and relate. I designed a form or product in which my children could record the stuff that they learned. That was communicating, and our rhetoric. And so all of this work resulted in this beautiful handmade scrapbook that we stitched together by hand. And the many projects that we did had their special place in the book. It was all laid out in chronological fashion, following a timeline that I had made. Here, I'll show you the timeline. Now, I'm not showing you this because I'm proud of it. It was great for me. I did this a little bit of calligraphy, the history of the liberty of communication, his story. I wanted it to be authored by the Lord. I wanted to know his take on it. You can see the stitching in the book, in the binding of the book. This is the contents of the book. And then the timeline, the introduction. Okay, so here's the timeline. 5 stages of recording information. So it's a history of written communication. So here's the timeline that I made of the history of written communication. And so you can see how extensive the work was. A map following the history and God's plan for communication. And so I did a little bit of study on that to get the biblical principles, pull that out. And I had Catherine. John wasn't able to do that much writing at the time, and so I had him doing the projects with us. It started with proto writing, so it was all about that, and then we knotted quipu cords and different things, and tally sticks, and we did pictographs, and those are thing pictures, and I chose creation for the pictographs. So you can see it's just a crazy amount of work. It took us the better part of 1 year to do all of this, and hieroglyphs, pictures and symbols. And so I made this up, my hieroglyph, having to do with God and how all communication came from him, and cuneiform, and I'm not going to go show you all of these, but like ideas, symbols, rebus, missing link, alphabets, languages, it's just the history of communication and writing, and then the English language principles and the biography of Noah Webster, which we had read, different writing surfaces, writing tools. And I'm going to show you this page because this is what's really laughable. This is what my kids remember, was these activities. They remember making quill pens and writing with their own quill pens, ink that they made. And so that's what they remember from this project. It was John is drawing from a quill pen. They made little clay stamps with their monograms, and it's just laughable. Honestly, it's laughable today. And I should show you a little bit of Catherine's work too. I'm not going to go through all the pages, but here, that she's copying what I was doing. You know, this was the creation, pictographs, thing pictures. She did all this writing, proto writing. She did all the same writing that I did, and then the kids did the projects together. So, oh my, I'm out of breath thinking about it. I went through all of that, and I came to see, because the unit method was really popular back then. It was a fairly new concept in schools, and so, you know, in the 80s, and so I had used it a couple of times, but there I was revisiting again, and I thought, you know, at the time we were going through this project, my kids were actually interested in it. They even enjoyed the process. I didn't have grumbly children, but they learned very little, and they retained even less. And it was several years later when there was no evidence of lasting fruit from that experience except that they knew how to make the quill pen. And that's what they remembered about it. So what happened? Because God had given me so much revelation, what happened? So taking a closer look at that product helped me to see why they did not learn as much as I had hoped they would. I had learned through my study of learning that the product is a result or outgrowth of something. So this product, the blue book, this finished product, was actually reflecting my learning process. Okay? This product of Catherine's was reflecting whose? It was reflecting my learning process. I was getting things crossed up. I was the student. I was the one that exercised all the learning tools of research, reason, relate, record, and rhetoric. Catherine was copying what I did, but she didn't collect it up, organize it, or anything. I had to do all of that to provide pieces of a learning activity for my kids. And that's what curriculum is all about. It provides a piece of an experience. It's like in baking, cooking class in school. What the teacher would do is we're baking a cake and we had to divide the activities up between the students. One would crack an egg, another would measure the flour, another would measure the sugar, somebody else got to stir, you see, turn on the oven. Nobody got to do the whole thing. We didn't get to experience the whole thing. We got to experience a piece of it, you see. So the product represented me and my learning process. It was an outgrowth or effect or a harvest of my learning process, but I had used it as a means to cause my students learning, and it didn't work. There's nothing essentially wrong except that my children remained in a passive role, gaining secondhand the pre-digested knowledge that I spent a great deal of time actively gathering. It took much longer for me to learn it than it did for me to teach it to them. It's labor intensive, you see. This is why people use curriculum, because somebody else wrote it and did all the hard work. But it's the hard work that provides the education, not the piecing it out. So their process of learning was dramatically shortened, resulting in what was for them a shallow experience. But I experienced a quality product that they would internalize to come out of a shallow experience. You see, I expected a quality product that they would internalize to come out of their shallow experience. Does that make sense? You see, I had a deep, meaningful experience, and they had a shallow one. And there I was expecting a quality product to come out of their shallow experience. So I had an excellent learning experience, even if I felt somewhat overwhelmed in trying to learn and teach at the same time. So I was actively engaged in the learning process. Therefore, everything I learned was internalized. I internalized it, but they couldn't internalize it because it was being pieced out to them. So in teaching this unit, I shortened their process in favor of a more immediate product, because after all, they were going to school and they needed a product to prove it. You see, they needed a product to prove they were being schooled. So I shortened their process so they would have a product. I did all the hard work. So the material being presented to them ended up having little meaning because of the minimal relation it had to their lives, their interest levels, and their current abilities. They didn't choose the subject. I did. They gained temporary knowledge, and even experienced pleasure in the process, especially when projects were incorporated into the lessons. But it still resembled more of an artificial learning experience than the real thing. So if used exclusively, the unit study approach, as described here, would place a tremendous amount of burden upon both my children and myself. If the goal is to merely gain content too much too soon, the pressure is on to move quickly through studies. And so I wanted my children to acquire lifelong learning habits and interests. I wanted them to permanently possess the knowledge that they spent time acquiring, because that was one of the principles of learning, is to permanently possess the knowledge learned. That was the first principle I uncovered, was to learn, was to permanently possess all the knowledge being learned. Well, there's no such thing as permanent possession of knowledge being learned when it's being pieced out to a student. Learning too much about a subject all at once would not accomplish that. Not when it's just being pieced to them and they're just supposed to be able to memorize information long enough to pass a test. Like with traditional subject matter, you see? If given enough time to truly enjoy the process and internalize what was learned, then there was a chance for a vital, delight-directed learning process to develop. I just decided there had to be another way. Yeah, I'm sure you're tracking with me now, huh? But haven't you done similar things? Haven't you expected a quality product out of a... Haven't you expected your kids to get great grades out of a learning process that wasn't even theirs? Haven't you done that? Yes, I think we've all done that. But I began to wonder if there could be another way to implement the wonderful unit study concept, a method that I hoped would produce the desired product. And that's when I came up with the unit of life approach. And when I had Catherine do the Bird book. And that way I would stop doing the bulk of the work. I wouldn't experience burnout anymore. And my children would not remain passive learners. They would become actively involved in their own learning process and in the projects that communicated what they knew. So I wanted my children to become students of life and actively pursuing learning on their own. And I knew that a love of learning was the key to permanent possession of the knowledge acquired during a study. So I knew that my ideas were starting to make sense, and it would free me from having to labor over everything I wanted them to know, and what freedom this brought to me. So, but I recognized the challenge that lay before me to cultivate in their lives a natural learning process. And I felt that for a natural learning process to be biblical, it must bear the fruit of a love of learning and an avid desire to produce many avenues of learning. So I came to see that there was a sharp contrast between filling my children with information as if they were empty receptacles versus the wonderful results of my own active learning experience. And I knew that the unit method as we know it, it's based on a solid natural concept, having natural origins, but somehow the naturalness of it had been lost in the process of adapting it to a school-style setting where the teacher is still pre-digesting all the material for the student. Anybody who wants to learn something on their own would go about it the same way I did. I went to the library, I gathered books and information, I sorted it all out, same way I did with the subject of learning in the Bible Concordance and Dictionary. Anybody who wants to learn a subject thoroughly for themselves will do the same thing. That's a vital life process that can produce a product that came right from their own process, and they would internalize truths and principles and knowledge and permanently remember most of it, as opposed to not remembering hardly anything of some subject that was pre-digested for them. So I observed that for the student who actually is doing the work, the process of a unit study has the same procedural components necessary for the practice of all the 5 learning tools: the research, reason, relate, record, and rhetoric. So it's a natural study process, and everything I wanted actually developed in my children was there. So as far as a learning process is concerned, so what happens with curriculum, pre-digested curriculum, is a natural thing is becoming twisted. It becomes a twisted version of what could be a life-giving experience for a student, and then keeping the child in a passive role. But then what happens is a child is expected to demonstrate their grasp of the material, even though they were in a passive role doing assignments only. And now communication, I had come to see at that time that needed to be a goal in determining if the student is really learning. But if someone else had done most of the work, the research, the recording of all the information, and where they were understanding how to relate to real life and reasoning out truths and making connections, it had become personally meaningful to them. Demonstrating possession, if none of that happened for the student, which is rhetoric, is too much to expect. Can you see how we're crossing it up? We're crossing it up. Listen to this. Rhetoric. To expect is to communicate on content where there has been no need to know it to begin with, as well as a complete lack of interest in it, is a completely unreasonable expectation. To expect kids to communicate on content, which is rhetoric, that is coming from within them, and they are passionate about it, is a reasonable expectation. Do you see? That's a burden they can bear. Are you following me? If you don't learn anything else, learn this. All the textbook work your children are doing is a burden to them. Would you want to do it? Come on, moms, tell the truth. Tell the truth. Are you interested? How much were you ever interested? All right. It's an unreasonable expectation. All right. Remember this. It became evident to me that content is only one side of the educational coin. What mom doesn't want to see her kids love to learn and know how to learn? These are the 2 most important principles that work together. Rather than trying to force a premature product from new areas of interest, a more logical way that I concluded would be to allow time for those interests to develop casually, with less demand placed upon the child to produce skill work seen in a final product. The most important principle is that instead, it would be more effective to refocus the desired formal efforts of detailed plans and application of skill work toward the child's areas of current mastery, the interests he already has. How long has he been interested in a thing? Well, that's why I got the bird book idea going for Catherine, because the interest had been there for so long. Of course she was going to immerse herself in the notebook. She loved it. In fact, I only expected her to work 2 hours a day at that point. She was old enough to do that much, and she had the skills. And so I only expected her to work 2 hours a day. And she came to me and asked if she could do it on the weekend. And is it okay if I work more than 2 hours a day? That's when I really knew that my insights were taking hold and working. The sewing I had begun to do, the new sewing, the new expectations were becoming way more reasonable, and they were getting the desired responses from my children. You see, she had current mastery, and that's what she needed to communicate. You see, that's what needed to happen. The demand for skill work, which is the rhetoric part, would then become a reasonable expectation, especially if the purpose is to help your child to exercise good stewardship over the things he currently knows well and has an interest in. He could fully utilize the content from his already developed interests, pursuits, and experiences to practice the 5 learning tools in producing an exciting product that reflects his own learning process, something that he can be proud of. And so this informal learning process would then be allowed to overflow freely in new areas of interest without the undue pressure of producing a product. And so in this way, the product we want now can be acquired, while at the same time we allow other learning pursuits the time needed to mature into quality products that communicate what the child has internalized. So these insights were not only gained through my personal unit study experience, but I witnessed wonderful products of various kinds begin to surface in my daughter. Now, her products were not a result of the education that I labored to provide for her, but rather resulted from her own self-initiated learning process, and I was beginning to see more clearly, but I still had many questions, and fear continued to drive me just a little bit. So in the fall of '88 to the winter of 1990, it was Egypt or the Promised Land. I was going back and forth, questions, doubts, fears. And this was the most difficult period of my homeschooling adventure, and eventually became the best part of it for all the valuable lessons I learned when I allowed the Lord to show me the way. So at first, it seemed as though he was asking me to give up all the wonderful truth that I discovered through the principle approach. Instead, I began to see that he simply had a more efficient way for us to provide an education for our children. And he was asking me to receive his yoke and his burden, which is tremendously lighter than the heavy curriculum burden I had accepted from man. So I continued to hold to his truths that he revealed to me, but I started to seek him for a better way. I still had so much to learn. So the thought of deviating from the norm that the scholars and the experts had laid out was frightening. I knew the Lord had something to show me, but I was learning the hard lesson that my personal drive to uncover and apply truth could become a high place that took the place of the Lord. And it had the potential of becoming an idol in my heart, the principle approach, because it was so good and so rich. God would be pleased, though, with Jesus as Lord of my heart. So I continued. I wanted his yoke. It was my true desire. I knew he had a plan. So I decided to trust. This is early 1990. And I knew that God wanted to show me. And he told me at the time to take a rest from school. And of course, that was accompanied by a gripping fear. What would I be doing instead? How could I not be doing something for my children's education? We knew our commitment to homeschool was for life, that we would never put them back in school. So a prolonged break for me meant one for them too. And it wouldn't be, Jim would not actually allow me to do that at that time. It would be another year before I could. And so I just continued, and that's when I did the unit study. But anyways, so I went on for about a little while longer, and we didn't have, when he finally said that I could take a break. It was probably the beginning of 1990, and we went for 8 months to September 1990, and our life and our homeschool would never be the same after that. The revelations the Lord gave me during those 8 months, He opened my eyes to see my children, to truly see them. I came out of bondage into liberty through that. I got up on a mountaintop. It dawned on me, so many things dawned on me during that 8-month season of rest, that during those few years that I was acquiring for myself a broad and strong and deep education that was deeply founded on biblical truth and gave me a biblical worldview and purposeful approach to life that few I knew possessed. It literally propelled me into a dimension of thought and life experience that I didn't have prior to that time. And it gave me the feeling of being confidently equipped to do anything I wanted to do, which for me meant pursuing God's will, my sole desire. But the confidence was of a different quality than any I had ever felt. I recognize this being not of a self nature, but of a faith nature coming from God and having been planted deep within me, changing me forever. And so that season of study and obedience had also revealed God's purpose and plan, whereas before, for me, I didn't even know one existed for me. It built within me the deep character I lacked, having come from a sinful worldly background only a few short years before. The effect of the study that I undertook was not superficial or temporary. It changed my life. So, not only it became more increasingly clear to me that my experience was what I wanted for my children, the discipling aspect as well as the scholarship aspect, the educational. And so I realized that I would need to change the way I was doing things. I felt extreme freedom and joy. I'm going to skip down here. I want to show you the door of hope in the wilderness that God gave me when he said to stop and he was going to open my eyes. He said to me, I want you to see now what has been taking place. And this is 1990, during those 8 months, okay? The years of obedience were bearing fruit. So I noticed, these are some things I noticed, that my children were happy, they were contented, and they enjoyed their life at home. They enjoyed being together, they played together well, they did projects together, and I'd been training them. And they enjoyed being with me. And they were busy doing many wonderful things, and they were seldom ever bored. And I knew I had consciously encouraged this so that in their spare time, that would drop. That boredom wouldn't become a problem. That would draw me away from my study time to have to entertain them. They were, they had well-formed learning activities going on. So I was grateful for uncomplicated happy days and for my children's love and zeal for living. And our family had been going through a time of restoration and redemption from the effects of worldly living before that. And so we were becoming normal and healthy, and it felt wonderful. And Catherine and John had been busy during their spare time for many years, and so I just want to show you some of the things they had been doing. And initially, I didn't look at these activities as part of their real education. Remember, this is where God was opening my eyes to see. And so it took those 8 months for him to slowly show me what was really happening behind those activities, okay? So I want to show you first just a couple mutual projects that the kids were doing together. I mean, I'm talking about kids here. they played together. So here, you know, they did cardboard boxes. This was at Christmas time, and Catherine, you know, was making a reindeer and a sleigh, and there's John being Santa, and she was a reindeer, and they did lots of little things like that with cardboard boxes. You know what kids do. They like to play with cardboard. They did crafts together. They had dolls that Catherine made. They're called orcs. This particular one was clay, out of clay. That's a little orc creature that they made up at the time out of clay. But she had dolls that she made. She and John both had an orc doll, and they made a big world. You know, they made an animal world, a complete language. They just played orcs. And you know, that was just one of the things they did. And many activities. You know, they still have those dolls today, and their grandkids love playing with them. It's so funny. They just love it. And of course, the grandkids love anything to do with what Mommy and Daddy used to play with, or their aunt and uncle used to play with, depending on who it is, you know. I want to show you a little picture book. Catherine did this on her own. My picture book. This was something that she did on her own. And she was just 8. She was just 8. And what it is a story about a squirrel. And she wrote a story. Once a red squirrel went to the river. So this is what it looks like. There's a picture. She was 8 years old. Squirrel went to the river, and she did that. This was not an assignment. This was Catherine doing it on her own. A story, okay? And she goes all the way through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 pages. The squirrel didn't get bothered anymore. The end. You know, it's the end. She made a whole storybook, had a picture on every page, and she wrote a story. All right? Well, that's great. Did I consider that to be part of her school? No, I didn't. That's a shame. All right, I want to show you another project that they might have done together. Oh, this is funny. They made a flying airplane on a swing. Isn't that cute? Flying airplane on a swing. Okay, they just nailed some boards together and they went flying. John was 7 and Catherine was 11. Yeah. Okay. They played together. Okay. They did projects together. You know, I've been providing education for my kids at great expense in both time, energy, and money. But in retrospect, when God opened my eyes to see some of the things they were doing, I began to see how important their learning process was. And you're asking me, would a unit study be all right if it's something the child desires to learn? Well, based on the principles I just got through describing to you, don't you think that if it's something that they should want to learn, that they should be doing some of the learning themselves? That it shouldn't be pre-digested for them. They should be able to learn it at their level. Their ability to research at any given time. Do you see? Whatever they're able to research, okay? How they're able to do it. You can guide them, but they should be able to do it. Here. My kids, they tended the yard. the garden, so to speak, the garden, the yard. They tended to their small surroundings. And in 1987 to 1991, they were developing a nature collection. And they just collected all this stuff. And it was just unsightly. It was everywhere. And I wanted it, you know, containers and bottles and jugs and boxes, you know, lining the side of the house with things in it. And I wanted something done with it. And they were having critters that they were feeding and taking care of that they would find, you know, frogs and snakes and who knows what else. And so I asked Jim to build this for them. And it's a little compartmentalized. There's 5 compartments with little doors to each one. There they are right there, the big compartments, and each one has a little door. And I asked them to get rid of all of the extra containers. I asked them to, I laid down some rules about taking care of critters that in winter they needed to hibernate, so they had to let them go. And then while they were in the compartments, they needed to feed them and create habitat for them. And so they did. They did all of those things. They also had all these things from nature, and I wanted them to do something with them. And so I asked them to start documenting the things they wanted to keep. Okay? Now, they weren't into scientific terminology at that time, you see? So I didn't expect it of them, but I did expect them to steward what they knew and what they had. And so Catherine documented the nature collection and how much of everything they had and some of the dates that things were collected, you know. This is all done in pencil, so it's kind of hard to see, but it goes through. There's several pages here. This was their nature collection, and there's a documentation of animal tracks they found and different things they spotted, wildlife that they spotted in nature, and just different things. Edible mushrooms. I mean, it goes through the whole book. The book is mostly full, just one of those little composition notebooks. And so I had them doing, and John had a bones collection, and so he documented that. He had little mammal skins and tails, and he made a notebook of that. What else? I mean, there were others, and I'll show those to you another time. But when it came to researching, it needed to come from within themselves, what they knew how to do, the level they knew how to operate with the learning tools. They knew how to find scriptures, and so they could look that up, because I taught them how to use the concordance and the dictionary that way. They knew how to look up words in the dictionary. But I didn't expect them to come up with a big thing at those ages. You see, I would ask them, can you add a scripture to that? Or can you, you know, whatever it is, can you find a definition for this? Can you find what the correct terminology is for this? You see, scientific terminology. But I wouldn't expect them to come up with a unit study. And so the whole project was scaled to their ability at any given time, and they did the work. I simply guided. I didn't do the work for them. So remember that. They will grow their process up. They will grow it up. So read this book, The Critter Habitat, okay? I just showed that to you. I'm not going to describe all of that because it's taking too long. Okay, and then they kept spider webs, or spiders, I should say. They kept spiders in a cage, of all things, because they wanted to see the different patterns of webs so they could identify them. Okay, well, By the time Catherine was 15, she knew how to identify spider webs just from that one little activity they did as children. They did that as children. And so, oh, that you can't see that because of all the reflection. I'm going to show you one. Let me see. Spiderweb book, The Garden Spider. This is a real spider web that Catherine collected. And this is her spiderweb book, The Grass Spider. You know, the grass spider. She didn't look these up. She knew what they were because of studying the spider webs in the box they created for spiders to make webs. Long-jawed orb weaver. And there they are. I know there's more in here, but I'm not going to go into them all. She collected the spider webs. Well, they'd feed them and they'd watch them work, and they were curious. They would find an anthill to observe its habits for a few days. They would put a little dot on the back of a bee, and that was landed on some meat that they would put out to see what it would do and if they would ever see it again. And they did. They would see the same bees over and over, or a fly or something like that. So they did experiments, you know, testing things. They did that sort of thing. They collected bugs, flying bugs, to feed the frogs and the snakes, and they got to witness a lot of really interesting things in those compartments. So remember that collecting knowledge is only 1/3 of the learning process, and so you know, you do want them producing some things, but of course you want it to be within the boundaries, reasonable boundaries of their own learning process, where they are at any given time. Does that make sense? I hope so. So through the learning styles, they could, if they wanted, put together their own unit study based off of what they have learned. Yes, and I call it unit of life because it is a unit of their own life. It's an interest of their own life, like Catherine's bird book was. Yes, a unit of life. Good. Unit of life. That's what it is. You know, my kids wanted a natural history museum when they were little, and they used to draw plans, kind of designing what it would look like. And this was back in 87, 88, you know, they were just children. And it wasn't until Catherine was 18 that I found the perfect display case. And I had Catherine go through the entire nature collection and choose all the best specimens of things and document it all, make labels. And I was trying to get a hold of the pictures of it to show you, and I couldn't find the pictures in time. So when I do find them, I'll show them to you. But so that nature collection has been on display in my home all these years. And she is 45, and she put it together when she was 18. And John's bone collection is in it, Catherine's bird nest, the eggs, the feathers, all the sea things from the sea, skeletons that John cleaned up and displayed, and even some bugs. But most of his bug collection, his real extensive bug collection, is in his possession. And I told him that when he unearths it from storage, I would sure like to have pictures of it to show my audience, and different things that the kids have that I don't have in my possession. But my grandkids absolutely love looking at my kids' nature collection. They just love it, and that's why I keep it out, because it was a rich learning process for many years for my kids, and I wanted something done with it, or I would have had to throw it all away, you know. I still have some that aren't that don't fit in there. Like they have plaster casts of animal tracks and different things that just wouldn't fit in the display case that they didn't want me to get rid of. So I still have some of that, but other than that, I've, you know, like Catherine's, she had quite an extensive butterfly collection, and just a few butterflies are in the display case, and things like that. So I want to show you a picture of my kids when they were during that age. It's Catherine and John. So the time I'm describing is that age. That's what I'm describing. They were so cute. Of course they were so cute. I didn't tell them that. You know how mommies don't tell their kids? They tell their grandkids way more than they tell their own children, I think. I didn't tell my kids they were so cute. But I can say it now. All right. And so I'll go back into this chapter and resume that next week and show you many more of the projects and show you how I transitioned over to lifestyle of learning, because God was revealing so much to me during those 8 months, and that's where I want to begin again for you next week. Show you the revelations of it, because I know you're still trying to understand things for yourself right now, and you're still going to have a schoolish mindset and a wrong focus, crossing ideas and principles up, trying to expect too much too soon. What I want to do is show you how this can become this, which is an essay Catherine wrote when she was 19. See, this is, she did a comparison. This is all her writing. She did a comparison between she called it the War of the Wizards, the Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter. And it's a spiritual comparison of what the difference is. And she did this work all on her own. How does that go from a simple little story to true adventures with nature, to discussing abstract concepts, spiritual concepts that I didn't teach her? Okay, how does that happen? That's what I want to show you, because this was her work. This was my work. That was my work. This was her work. And this is what I want to help you see. And I'm going to do the same thing with John. I want to show you how that happens. How does a drawing go from this at the age of 8 to this? I'm just got to go to this. To this. You saw the bird drawings, okay? This is artist colored pencils that Catherine drew, okay? She drew that freehand. Okay, you see that? How do you do that without an art class, without a teacher? You know, this was a painting. Okay, a painting. Mommy and young horse, baby horse. Sorry for the lights, but that's my lights. Okay, so how does that happen? How does a child grow their learning process? You let them, and you make sure character is in place. That's your job, Mom, training them in character, training them in those learning tools so they can advance their education on their own. Without the learning tools, they can't. They don't know how to learn. They don't know how to do anything. If they're stuck in text workbooks all the time, they don't know how to do very much, okay? Release them, and help them to get grounded and strengthened in the learning tools right from where they're at. Doesn't God reach you right from where you're at? Yes, he does. So God bless you, ladies, and go love on those precious kiddos today. They are very dear to the Lord, all right? I will see you next time with way more examples, and I'll share with you more of the principles. Bye-bye.